Welcome back to the Miraculous Mamas podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Joy, and we believe in empowering women through storytelling and education. Last week, we had an amazing episode with Brianne Davis. She is an actress. She opens up about her sex and love addiction and the work that she has done and how she is helping others now move through that, how that affected her life in Hollywood. And she just has an incredible story. So if you didn't listen, make sure that you go back and check that out. Next week, we have on Samantha Bush, and she's sharing her infertility journey with us. And man, I had such an amazing time talking with her. She's been through so much and still on her journey and on her path to have her second child. And it was just incredible hearing her story, but not only her sharing her story, but what she's doing for others now, because infertility is a disease, and yet insurance companies don't recognize it as that. And a lot of couples don't have coverage, and it's very expensive. So she's trying to work with legislators. She's getting involved in government to try to help change people's minds, to help families be able to afford this. She's set up grants to help couples be able to have kids. She's just such an incredible woman, and her story is really powerful. So you're definitely going to want to tune in next week. This week, I am so excited about this episode too. So we've talked a lot about breastfeeding on the podcast, but we have not talked about formula. And today we have on Mallory, known as the Formula Mom on Instagram, and she's a infant feeding technician, and she just is such a resource of just all things formula. And I learned so much from her because honestly, I didn't really know anything. And there's tons of, there's stigmas and stereotypes, and people will spew some. They'll be like, well, studies show this. And it's like, actually, when you look at the data, this might not be true. So it was really awesome talking to her. I feel like it's a very important conversation to listen to, even if you're breastfeeding, if you're planning on only exclusively breastfeeding, if you think that you're never going to use formula, I still feel like it's an important conversation to listen to. Because you never know, you never know what situations may arise. And also just to hear the research and the information around formula feeding. And I think also just to kind of create community, there can be judgment between breastfeeding moms and formula feeding moms. And it's really unnecessary, and it's unsupportive, and there's nothing productive about that. So I think it's really important to just hear the conversation, listen to everything that Mallory has to say, to continue to grow in our community as moms, to be able to support each other. As soon as somebody's like, oh no, I'm formula feeding. And you're like, oh really? That's just, there's so many reasons why people choose to formula feed. There's a lot of reasons why people choose not to, but, both options are very valid options. Both options provide nutrition for children. Both options allow kids to thrive, not just to survive, but to thrive. So it's just such a great conversation for me to learn a lot, and it really opened my eyes to a lot of information as well. So I'm super excited to have her on, and we're going to dive right into the interview. All right, everyone, I have Mallory Whitmore here, and I am so excited to talk to her because I know nothing about formula, and she is the formula mom. So I have had podcasts on here about breastfeeding before, and we haven't talked about formula, which I'm so excited for because there's so much I feel like to unpack with formula. There's stigmas around it, but when you actually look at research, you should be really surprised to see some of the stuff that comes up. It's not like your 10-year-old who is breastfed is going to be smarter and healthier than your 10-year-old that was formula fed. So I'm super excited to kind of dive into all of that. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Mallory.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you because like I said, I know nothing about it, but I do know the one thing I know about formula is that I feel like like for me, like I've gone back to work and I hate pumping and I'm trying to figure out what to do. And I've thought about supplementing with some formula when I get called in, and I don't know where to begin. And then also I feel kind of ashamed, and I know that neither of those things should be obstacles for me having that as an option for my family.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say up front that both of those feelings are super common. You know, I don't want to normalize it and say, oh, that's a very normal thing, but they're very common. And I think part of that is because there's just a total lack of formula education around. There's not a lot of places where parents can turn for really high quality supportive information around formula feeding. And then number two, obviously, we live in a breast is best culture right now, and that has swung dramatically, even from 20 or 30 years ago. And so there is a lot of shame and a lot of fear and a lot of guilt around it. And what's interesting is that by 6 months, 75% of infants have had some formula, according to the CDC. By and large, the majority of people that you see, that you interact with, either in person or on the internet, have used formula by 6 months. But it's easy to feel like you're the only one because no one talks about it, because everybody feels ashamed. And it sort of perpetuates this stigma where we all think that we're the only ones, when in reality, the majority of people are in the same boat. So that's one of my big goals, is to sort of destigmatize formula by talking about it so that people realize that they're not alone.
I would love to, I guess, to maybe talk about some of the stigmas that you find most common surrounding formula.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear-mongering and misinformation that surrounds formula. And I think a lot of the stigma comes from ultimately feeling like, if I give formula, I'm going to be a bad mom because formula means XYZ. Formula means my kid's going to be sicker. Formula means my kid's going to have a lower IQ. Formula means that my kid is going to be obese or whatever else. And so I think the biggest way that I work to break the stigma is to try to reframe some of that misinformation and fear-mongering that gets placed around formula feeding. And so in large part, what that looks like is just helping parents understand what the research actually says and the limitations of the research. So, for example, a large study that was done in Belarus in the late 80s found that there was a difference in obesity rates among children who were formula fed. So you'll see that statistic a lot where, formula fed babies have an X percentage more likelihood of being obese. But when you control for family factors and you look at siblings where one was breastfed and the other was formula fed, there is no difference in obesity rate. And so you can take that information and conclude that it wasn't about the formula. It was about the family factors that led a family to choose formula also tend to lead them to make choices that can lead to obesity. And that gets all tied into socioeconomic status and food deserts and everything else. But it's tricky because a lot of the research about breastfeeding is not sort of randomized controlled trials, because it's not ethical to assign people that they have to breastfeed or assign people that they can't breastfeed. And so the research is not quite as strong in that way, since we can't set it up as a truly equitable research design, if that makes sense.
Well, and you find that, I feel like, when it comes to pregnancy and all of these things anyways, there's just no studies. Yeah. So I even know, like, as when I was pregnant, I'm like, can I really not eat this? Because there's never been a study, because they can't be like, oh, you have to eat this so we can see what happens, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to have sushi once while I'm pregnant. And I think I'm going to be okay.
And truly, I think even that is important, of like talking to parents about risk management and, like, this is what the risk says. And then you take that information and you make a decision based on what your risk tolerance level is, based on your other factors and everything else, for sure. There's just a lot of nuance there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right, we are going to take a quick break to talk about a new app that I discovered that is amazing, and that is Chime. Chime is an award-winning app and debit card with no hidden fees or monthly minimums, and I want to share with you a few of their absolutely amazing features. First, the fee-free overdraft on up to $100 in debit card purchases with SpotMe. It's like overdraft protection, but way better. Also, you can get your paycheck, benefits, stimulus check, tax return up to 2 days earlier with direct deposit. No hidden fees or monthly minimums. You can turn on alerts to let you know when your card is used and instantly block your card if something seems fishy. You can save on autopilot when you sign up for a Chime spending account. You can enroll in an optional savings account and grow your savings automatically with 0.50% annual percentage yield. That's 10 times the national average. So right now, join the millions on Chime. Sign up, takes 2 minutes, and it doesn't affect your credit score. Apply now at chime.com/mamas. That's chime.com/mamas. Chime is a financial technology company. Banking services provided by the Bancorp Bank or Stride Bank N.A. members FDIC. Eligibility requirements and overdraft limits apply. Overdraft only applies to debit card purchases. Limits start at $20 and may be increased up to $100 by Chime. Early direct deposit depends on the payer. Out-of-network cash withdrawal fees apply. Third-party and cash deposit fees may apply. Go to chime.com/mamas for details. Have they done any newer studies on formula?
I know that there are some that are sort of in process. None that I know of I feel like super excited about. And I'm like, yes, I cannot wait for the research to come out. And I don't know, I think in large part that's because there's this international code of marketing that is in place from the World Health Organization that formula companies can't promote breast milk substitutes. They can't advertise. And so I think because of that, there's just less funding in terms of research, because even if the research was good, they wouldn't be able to promote it. So that's my personal opinion. I don't know if that's actually the case, but to me, that's what I think leads to sort of that dearth of research.
Sounds legit. So what would be, I guess, like another misconception? I know at the beginning I kind of mentioned that health, and I know kind of in those first couple months, yes, there are benefits to breastfeeding, but at the same time, when you look at the long-term effects, the research doesn't support that one kid's going to be healthier than the other or smarter in school than the other. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do those two pieces separately, the intelligence and the sickness, because those three, intelligence, sickness, and obesity, are the biggest ones that people come to me concerned about. So speaking about IQ first, the largest study that people cite to indicate that breastfed babies have higher IQs, and that's specifically in verbal IQ, did not control for the IQ of the mother. They just compared breastfed, formula fed, and they did not separate based on IQ of the mother. And we know that the biggest factor in terms of how your kid's IQ is going to turn out is how their parents' IQ looks. It's genetic. And so once they controlled for those factors for the mother's IQ, there was no longer any statistical significance. So, and that goes back to, again, women with higher IQs are more likely to breastfeed because they're also more likely to have flexible jobs, which allow them to take longer maternity leave because they're salaried versus hourly and all of this. So IQ is directly correlated with the mother's IQ, not with how you feed. And once they controlled for the mother's IQ, there was no longer any difference. So that's IQ. And then in terms of illness, I think what's important for folks to know here is to look at the relative risk. So a lot of times you'll see statistics that'll say formula-fed babies are twice as likely to get an ear infection. And you're like, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. Twice as likely. Like that's, 100% more, 200%, whatever. But what they don't tell you is that the risk has gone from 2% to 4%.
Right.
So yes, it's double the risk, but your overall total risk is still super low, no matter how you feed. And that's just for ear infections. So there's a very slight increase in risk of ear infections and a very slight increase in risk for gastrointestinal, like stomach bugs. But the research has disproven any sort of concern about asthma, eczema, upper respiratory infections. Leukemia was one that they debunked. type 1 and type 2 diabetes, all of those have been debunked. So there is an increased risk of ear infections and stomach bugs. But again, it's a very small risk. It's a couple of percentage points. And the majority of kids aren't going to have either before their first birthday, no matter how you feed them.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the research that it just drives me crazy, because working in the birth world, again, I see that all the time where they're like, well, you're tripling your risk of this happening to your baby. And I'm like, it literally goes from 0.1 to 0.3. Like,
right. Like that is not meaningful. Right. It's an increase in risk, but it's not a meaningful
right.
for what you do. Absolutely.
And you deserve
crazy.
Right. And you deserve to have all the information so that you, as the parent, can make the best decision for you and your family and feel empowered in that decision, not feeling shamed into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So I love that that we're talking about this, because, to be honest, those are some of the things that I've heard before, is that your kid's going to get more sick or going to not be as smart. And you had mentioned something interesting too, like looking at the mom's IQ, but also when you go into like more impoverished communities and stuff, there's also education factor, and there's a socioeconomical class factor that goes into all of this that just isn't taken into consideration in any of these studies.
Yeah, it's so tough because to me, it feels like we hold up breastfeeding as the standard, and without acknowledging that there are a lot of privileges that go along with being able to breastfeed for the recommended amount of time. Specifically, that you have a long enough maternity leave that you can establish a breastfeeding relationship. Mm-hmm. You have pump breaks, which requires that you have been at your job for at least a year and that your employer employs at least 50 people. And then we don't talk about the fact that those pump breaks aren't paid if you're an hourly worker. So you might be losing, roughly an hour of wages a day, which means you might have to stay later at work, which means that that's another hour you're paying for childcare. And it just cycles. It cycles and cycles. And so it really kills me when we essentially societally place the blame on women, when in reality, our social policies make it very, very difficult for some families to breastfeed successfully, because there's just not the support in terms of policies to make that feasible if you can't stay home, or if you can't take a long maternity leave, or if you can't afford to lose 5 hours of pay a week in order to pump. Mm-hmm. I think it's an important piece of the conversation that's historically been missing, of like, how do we approach the fact that being able to breastfeed is a privilege issue? Yeah,
that's so good. I remember at a job like 10 years ago, running to the bathroom. I used to work in nightclubs in Vegas, and running to the bathroom.
Oh, fun.
And one of the girls I worked with was pumping in the bathroom stall next to me. And that's where she used to have to go to pump, was in the bathroom stall. And I'm like, that's horrible.
I know. It's horrible. One of my jobs that I was in after my second was born had this beautiful designated pumping room. I was working at a university at the time, but it was literally across campus. And it was like I was going to lose 15 minutes there, lose 30 minutes pumping, and lose 15 minutes back. And that was an entire hour, and I needed to do that 2 or 3 times a day. That was 3 hours of my workday. Just, and so then the alternative was like a coat closet in the building. And so eventually I was like, I'm formula feeding. This is ridiculous. Like, this is not workable. And, we see this idea, if you have a breast pump, that women can have it all. Like, you can breastfeed your baby via pumping, and you can also still work. But it's certainly not that simple for a lot of folks. It's just more complicated than that.
Well, and I feel like there's a lot of misinformation about breastfeeding out there. I've heard a lot, like, you can't produce enough breast milk. That's a myth. Like, you're not doing it right then, when that's actually a thing. There are women who do not produce enough for their child, and you should not feel guilty feeding your baby.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I see and talk with a lot of women who have fallen in that category, where they have seen this rhetoric over and over that insufficient glandular tissue is very rare. It pretty much never happens. Low supply isn't really a thing if your baby is, effectively removing milk from the breast, whatever else. And then they don't know how to deal with it when they actually get that diagnosis and it's real for them. And so I think, there's just a lack of, I think, sort of really holistic information about some of the challenges that people face, both societally and physically or medically or whatever else. And it leads women who end up needing to stop breastfeeding or want to stop breastfeeding feeling like they have failed before their baby's even, a year old. They feel like they have failed at motherhood and they're not even a year in. And that's just really damaging.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are going to take a break to talk about mental health, which is something that affects all of us at some point in our lives. And if you're in that motherhood stage, I would say it affects you all the time. Maybe I'm just projecting from my personal experience, but since I've become a mom, it has made me come face to face with a lot of things I need to work on, which is why I love BetterHelp. They've made it so convenient for me to seek help with an online counselor, and it's professional, it's affordable, you get matched, I get to communicate in any way I want. So if I want to shoot them a text message or email or hop on a video chat, you can communicate however you feel comfortable, and you don't have to sit in an awkward waiting room waiting to see your therapist. So whether you're struggling with depression, stress, anxiety, relationships, how about all of 2020 and 21? Anything that's going on, BetterHelp is there for you. And in fact, so many people are using BetterHelp that they're recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. I want you to start living a happier life today. And as listeners, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/mamas. You can join over the 1 million people, including me, taking control of their mental health. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/mamas. I had a friend who had a baby. We actually, 5 days apart. Our babies are 5 days apart, and she didn't, breastfeeding was not for her. And so I asked her how her hospital experience was, and I said, how'd you feel about the staff supporting your decision? She said, I did not feel supported at all. They kept asking, are you sure you don't want to breastfeed? Are you sure you don't want to breastfeed? And she's like, no, I'm good. And she said, I just felt like they were kind of shaming me because I didn't want to.
Yeah. There are some hospitals now that will literally make you sign a waiver if you want to formula feed, a waiver that says that you have been informed of the benefits of breastfeeding and that you are going against medical advice in formula feeding. And it's so condescending, right? It's so paternalistic. It's not like you're choosing to take your baby and put them in a car without a car seat. There's the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, which was developed as a breastfeeding support initiative, in a lot of ways has gone super far extreme the other way and is taking away really valid autonomy from parents to make safe choices for their kids in order to meet certain hospital metrics. And that really troubles me. It really troubles me that they're treating a choice that is absolutely safe and that the FDA has cleared its safety and treating it as though it's an unsafe choice.
That's horrible.
It's horrible.
Oh my gosh. You have to sign a waiver to feed your child.
Yeah. And a lot of hospitals won't provide formula unless they decide there's a medical reason. So I always counsel women that if they plan to formula feed from the start, to bring their own pacifiers, their own bottles, and their own formula, because you just don't know now if you're going to run into some of these barriers. And when you're postpartum and you're bleeding and you're leaking and you're hormonal and you're recovering from a major medical event, you don't have the energy to try to nitpick with folks about what you need. And so I wish that I didn't feel like I had to sort of equip some of these families like they were going into battle right after they had their baby, and they're supposed to be in this magical, couple of first early days. But it's really difficult for some folks in some hospitals, and it is really unfortunate that that's an added burden on families when they're already dealing with, the tough stuff that is early postpartum.
Mm-hmm. And you see in some hospitals, and again, kind of based on probably the funding and the placement of some of these hospitals, that they don't, the opposite is true too. They don't give people really a choice to breastfeed. They just assume based on like your race and where you're birthing that you're just going to formula feed, and they just start giving your baby formula.
Yeah. Yeah. There seems to me to be very little like supported decision-making when it comes to feeding. And I'm sure you see this a lot in your birth work, that how important supported decision-making is as you're thinking about interventions or how to treat certain complications or whatever. And I really want to see that extend to the feeding portion after birth of like, what are your goals? What's important to you? How can we support you in those goals? How can we make this process easy and stress-free? How can we give you the education that you need? Because you're right. In most cases, it seems to me that people jump from one end to the other. Either they're like, this person's going to formula feed, we're not going to offer them breastfeeding support, or this person's going to breastfeed, we're not going to offer them formula information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the informed consent is just so important in all of women's healthcare. It's something that's really been lacking in just supporting moms from the get-go, starting with your birth and making you feel a part of it and empowered and not shaming you. And that goes into feeding your child. And like you were saying, that the repercussions of the choices that you make in that first year of motherhood and the shame that you might get can be detrimental to you. And so making sure that we have things set in place to support you, because we are the life givers of the world. Like,
right. Yeah.
Help
absolutely.
us.
Yes. This is how our humanity continues. Like, we cannot overstate the importance of that, for sure.
So I have a question on formula then. Are all formulas created equal?
This is a great question. And truly, I remember after my first, she's 4.5 now, probably 3 weeks postpartum, standing in front of the formulas at Kroger and just like crying because I felt so bad. Number one, that I was, buying formula. I didn't want anyone to see me buying formula. And then I had no idea what to pick, right? There are a million different choices. They all claim all sorts of different exciting and important things. And it's hard to know what you need. And so that's really where a lot of my work comes into. So in terms of, are all formulas created equal? Yes and no. So first, all formulas have the same nutrient profile as required by the FDA. So they all have the same general levels of carbs, fat, and protein, macronutrients, and then vitamins and minerals, micronutrients. And then they typically have some additives like essential fatty acids, prebiotics, in some cases probiotics. So in that way, all formulas are safe and healthy. They all provide the nutrients that a baby needs to grow and thrive. What differs significantly among formulas is the ingredients that they use to provide those nutrients. So just like you can get protein from salmon or you can get protein from a hot dog, different formulas use different ingredients to provide that protein or those carbs. So some might use lactose as the carb source, which is preferable in my book because that's the carb source that's naturally found in breast milk. Some might use corn syrup. Both provide the carbs that a baby needs for energy and growth, but in my opinion, the lactose is preferable. And so I spend a lot of time educating families to really ignore the nutrition facts because those are going to be the same formula to formula or similar enough, and to focus on the ingredients and pay attention to what the ingredients are and how manipulating the ingredients might meet your baby's need. So, for example, we know that breast milk has more whey protein than casein protein. Cow's milk is the opposite. So if you're looking for a formula that's similar to breast milk, you want a formula that has more whey protein, added whey in the ingredients list, because we know then that it mirrors the protein ratio in breast milk and it's going to be better tolerated for babies. And that's the sort of information that you don't get when you're standing in front of the formula aisle and it's like closest to breast milk, enhances brain development, whatever else.
You're like, do I have to choose one or the other?
Yes. And I have to choose one or the other. And so I counsel a lot of families on just how to read the label, how to understand what the composition of breast milk looks like, and therefore what a formula looks like that is close in composition to breast milk, as long as, your baby will tolerate it.
Is there, so there's two things you said that brought up questions for me. Is there a huge price point difference so that kind of better formula is maybe not affordable for everybody? And then you mentioned kind of tolerating on the gut, because, just so everybody knows too, when the baby comes out, they're going to have some gut issues breastfeeding or formula feeding because they're not used to eating food. They got everything through their umbilical cord. Their gut is developing by eating, so they're going to have gas and issues. But yeah, some things might be more tolerable than others.
Right. Yeah. So your first question about affordability. So yes and no. Generally speaking, corn syrup is cheaper than lactose, cheaper to produce, cheaper for manufacturing, whatever. So a lot of the corn syrup-based formulas are going to be cheaper. However, there are a couple of really good generic options. So one of my favorites it's called Generic Advantage. You can get it at Walmart, you can get it at Target. They're all the same store to store, as long as they're called Advantage. And it's lactose-based, and it uses milk as the base and then lactose for the carb source. It has added whey. It has prebiotics. It's a really good standard formula. And it's so funny because a lot of folks are really hesitant to use generics, even if they want to save money, because they've bought into this idea that Similac is best for brain development because that's what it says on the label. When in reality, you can get a high quality formula that is generic. The generic version called Tender is really good as well. It has 100% whey protein and partially hydrolyzed broken down protein for easy digestion. So there are some good options that are cheaper, but generally speaking, your organic options, your European style options, your non-GMO options are going to be more expensive and also more similar in composition to breast milk. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a line that you have to walk there in terms of what's affordable and how you rate what's important to you. And for some folks, affordability is absolutely most important because that's the only thing that can be important, in terms of what their resources look like. So there are some options, but generally speaking, as we see with all food, the higher quality you get, the more expensive it is. So that's number one. Number two, your question was about, if your baby can tolerate it and what that looks like. So you are absolutely right. And I talk through this constantly with my clients, that there are just normal baby digestive issues that occur, and gas, reflux, straining, those are all super normal and just part of the process of your baby learning to eat by mouth and learning to digest. And so, sometimes I see people who think if I just found the perfect formula, I wouldn't see any of this anymore. And that's not always the case. In large part, a lot of it is just letting them grow and letting their systems mature. But sometimes you'll see, if you have a baby that has really excessive reflux and they've been diagnosed with GERD, then choosing a formula that has a thickener built in can really help. It helps the formula sit heavier in the stomach. It's less likely to splash back up as reflux. If you have a baby who has an allergy, obviously, and you're seeing excessive mucus in the stool or blood in the stool or widespread rash, eczema, a hypoallergenic formula might be used. And so it's tricky to piece apart, what's a normal newborn symptom versus what indicates that this formula isn't the right fit. And it's a lot of trial and error, as well as trying to pay attention to even some what seem like minor clues like nasal congestion. Nasal congestion can mean that there's a sensitivity to the A1 beta casein protein in cow's milk formulas. And just try to piece apart. It's a little bit like almost like a murder mystery of you have these clues and then you sort of follow the clues and see what you need based on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like there's not a lot of education surrounding that either, what to look for. Mm-hmm. And then what you were saying kind of with if there's a certain case where they need a specialized formula, that stuff tends to be a lot more expensive. Does insurance help cover the cost if your baby has a special need?
It depends. And that's really unfortunate. So I'm working with a family right now, and their insurance will cover a hypoallergenic formula called Nutramigen, which is Enfamil's hypoallergenic formula. But it contains corn, and they're in the form of corn syrup. And their baby has done much better on Similac's hypoallergenic formula, Alimentum, which has a ready-to-feed option that's corn-free. It uses tapioca starch instead. And so their insurance has authorized them and will cover a hypoallergenic formula, but not the hypoallergenic formula that their baby needs, because apparently their baby also has a sensitivity to corn in addition to the milk. And so, it puts families in this position of, do we give our baby something that will continue to irritate their system because they're reacting to it, but it's free? Or do we somehow try to find, some of these hypoallergenic formulas are, $40, $50 a can, and you need 4 or 5 a month. You're looking at hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month, and that's really not workable. And we see the same thing with WIC, the Women, Infant, Children program. Those tend to cover formulas based on brand by state. So Illinois might only cover Enfamil formulas, and Tennessee might only cover Similac formulas, and Maryland might only cover Gerber formulas. And I talk with folks all the time who are just in that place of having to make a choice to use a formula that is not working as well for their baby, or whether they need to try to come up with the money to do something different. And it's just unfortunate. Mm-hmm. And I wish that there was another option. And sometimes, you can get samples from your provider or your pediatrician. You can call, the manufacturers and see if they'll send you samples or extra coupons. But honestly, that's a barrier for some folks in terms of stopping breastfeeding or stopping pumping, even if it is incredibly difficult and they're on a super restrictive diet. They don't know if they can afford to stop. Mm-hmm. And that's really tricky and is really damaging mentally, I think, for sure. Those
aren't really things that are talked about, I feel like, is parents having to make these choices of, do I give my baby the formula that I know they do best on? And, I work extra hours and I'm not home as much, or, whatever I have to do to cover the expense, versus, giving them a formula that maybe is cheaper. It's like nobody, these are things that I've never had a conversation with anybody about before.
Yeah, it's tricky. And some of them will combine. They will get, their free formula from WIC or that insurance covers, and then they'll buy the other formula and they'll do 50-50 in each bottle and try to find a middle road that works a little better. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard for some families feeling that early on, like, I know my baby needs me home, and I also know my baby needs this formula, and I need to choose which is more important because I need to work more to afford this formula. It's really, I think, a failure of our system to support families.
Right. These aren't choices that parents should have to be making.
No. And, we see that continuing, obviously, with food insecurity and things beyond infancy. But we know that infants are so vulnerable and that it's such a crucial developmental period that I wish that there was more support so that families didn't have to make those sorts of decisions during that really crucial first couple of months and years.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk quick about maybe the people who reach out to you and say, I'm getting so much crap from my family because I'm choosing to formula feed, or because I can't breastfeed, or my partner's not supportive. What would be your advice to those moms?
It is so tough. And this was a big part of my story too. I was formula fed. My husband was exclusively breastfed. It was important to him that our children were breastfed. And, we've been married almost 10 years. We have a very collaborative and equitable relationship. But at the end of the day, this could not be a collaborative decision because he has no breasts. And so, getting comfortable with identifying the choice to breastfeed as a bodily autonomy issue of my body, my choice, regardless of what the people that you respect think about that. And really getting to a point where you can respect yourself more than you respect the opinions of the people that you care about. And that's really tricky. And there's no sort of magic bullet for how you develop sort of the strength to do that, especially if you're a people pleaser, if you're a perfectionist, if you're used to being bad at boundaries, which I would say I'm all of those things. But really, yeah, it's just a process of sort of coming into yourself and saying, this is what I need. And I know fundamentally that if I am in a healthy, emotionally available, stable place, that's going to be most helpful for my family and more helpful than my breast milk. Mm-hmm. And trying to develop a thick skin, knowing that there are people that won't understand that.
Mm-hmm. One of my new favorite sayings is, you don't get a gold medal for ... So it's like, you don't get a gold medal in motherhood because you breastfed your baby.
No, you don't get a gold medal for suffering more than somebody else. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like the statement too, I think that comes with some formula fed is that you took the easy way out.
Yes. Oh gosh. It's so interesting because I know that breastfeeding is very difficult for some folks. For a lot of folks. But I see every day that formula feeding is also really difficult. And it's difficult for different reasons, right? It's difficult because a lot of women have to really wade through their own mental and emotional baggage about making the switch to formula. It's difficult because there's a lot of prep work involved. You can't just, surprise, your baby's hungry. You can't just, whip out your breast and feed them. There's a lot of expense involved. There's a lot of trial and error involved in terms of finding the right formula. There's a lot of dishes and sanitation concern and concern about food safety. And so they're both hard. They're just hard in different ways. And I don't want to say my favorite thing, but I always feel a little validated when somebody, who has exclusively breastfed decides to switch to formula and they express that this is not as easy as I thought it would be, that it's a bit more complicated than it looks.
You're like, I know.
Like, this is what I've been saying.
I mean, one of the reasons why I hate pumping is because I just hate cleaning the parts. Oh my gosh, it's such a headache to me. Like,
it's so bad.
It's time consuming. And I know formula feeding, I'm like, you're constantly washing bottles. You're constantly washing stuff. You have to prep it. Like you said, it's not like your baby cries in the middle of the night and you just pop them on your boob.
Just roll over. Yeah.
You have to get up and go make a bottle.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it all costs you something somewhere.
Yes.
Is what I've come to realize, that it's just a matter of where you're paying that cost.
Mm-hmm. So motherhood is hard. So what we can do is all support each other in our choices and in our journeys, and know that this person doesn't necessarily have it harder than that person. Sure. We all have hard parts of it in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
In different seasons. Some people were like, like one of my triggering questions right now, because my daughter's 6 months, is like, is she sleeping through the night? And I just want to flip people off when they say that, because she's not. And that doesn't mean like I don't get a reward. I don't get a gold medal because my baby's sleeping through the night. So leave me alone.
Right. Yeah. Something that I talk a lot about is about things like that being morally neutral, right? Like, sleeping through the night is morally neutral. You're not a good mom if your baby sleeps through the night, and you're not a bad mom if your baby doesn't. Like, that's just neutral. It just is. Mm-hmm. We don't have to assign worth to any of these things. They can be neutral. And that's sort of opposite of how I think that sort of thing is typically framed, especially on social media. Mm-hmm. Good thing and there's a bad thing. And if you're in the bad category, whether it's, not sleeping or whether it's formula feeding, that you constantly feel like you have to defend against it, when in reality, you're right. You you don't get a medal either way.
I know. Another quick question before we wrap up, because I've heard that it's a myth, but then I've heard it's true. If you give your baby formula before bed, do they sleep longer?
That is such a good question. And unfortunately, I think for me and my crew, the answer is no. When they looked at sort of long-term, when babies started sleeping through the night, and why, and what the factors were, there was no correlation. So generally speaking, there is a sort of accepted belief that formula is metabolized a little bit slower, that it takes the digestive system a little bit longer to process it. And that's the idea behind this myth that, okay, well, if it takes longer to metabolize, maybe they won't wake up hungry quite as soon and they'll sleep longer. But in reality, that didn't happen, because we know that babies wake up for a lot of reasons other than hunger, So if only.
I know, because I'm like in that 6-month sleep regression right now. And I'm like, if I just give her some formula before bed.
Would that work?
Is this going to work for me?
Maybe bottle feeding, no matter what's in the bottle, so that you can try to make sure it's a full feed. And I think one of the benefits of bottle feeding is that you know exactly how much they're eating. So for my son, he would eat at 4:00. He would eat at roughly 7:00 before bed. I would specifically give him a smaller bottle at 4:00 so that I knew he would take a bigger bottle at 7. So there is a little bit more that you can do with formula in terms of that sort of manipulation. But generally speaking, there's nothing about formula that makes them sleep more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ugh. But the problem with giving her a bottle is then I have to pump.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, you spend that, that cost somewhere.
Yeah, it all costs us something at some point.
It does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I've really loved this conversation with you. I feel like I learned so much. And for the listeners, I feel like it's just really valuable, even if you don't formula feed or you don't plan on it. It's really important to know about it so that you can just support other moms in their decisions. So if they are dealing with shame, or if they're dealing with just kind of breaking some of those stigmas, that you can be like, actually, research shows that your baby's going to be fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where can people find and follow you and connect with you at?
Absolutely. So I'm on Instagram and TikTok at The Formula Mom. And then, so that has a ton of free content, helpful tips, whatever. And then my website is theformulamom.com, and I offer some services, including a Formula 101 handbook, which has just everything that you need to know about formula and bottle feeding. And then I also offer consults and personalized formula recommendations that folks can purchase. So it's been so fun. We have a really great community over there. So if you're looking for formula education and support and sort of a safe place on the internet to talk about formula without shame, definitely come on over, because that's where it's at. We've got it happening.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you guys got so much out of this episode. It was not only a great conversation, but there's research and data. And Mallory's just completely immersed in the formula world. So she's heard the stories, she has all the information, and it's definitely a topic that I didn't know a lot about at all. So it was really awesome to talk to her. And another great resource, I was recently listening to the book Crib Sheets by Professor Emily Oster. And I love what she has to say about it too, because when it comes to breastfeeding and formula feeding, there's a lot to consider. And some of it is your time, your energy, your feelings. And a lot of times we say, like, after the baby's born, it's almost like, oh, your feelings aren't valid. It's like all about the baby. And that's just completely not true. Motherhood is tough. Motherhood, you still have feelings. You're a person. You need to take care of yourself. And breastfeeding can be such a struggle. And when your mental health isn't great, sometimes you need to hear that it's okay. Like, you have permission to give your baby formula. You have permission to feed your child another way. And that it's a safe way. It's an effective way. Your kid is going to be fine. Your kid is going to be more than fine. They're going to be great. It's not going to have long-term detrimental effects on your child at all, despite what you may have heard or what people have told you. So, and I think it's important to know too that formula feeding is hard as well. It's not an easy way out. It's also very time consuming. You're making the formula, you're feeding them, you're cleaning the part, you're cleaning everything, sanitizing everything, and doing it all over again. When your child's screaming because they're hungry, you don't have their food right on tap there. You have to go make it. And there's sacrifices with that as well. So again, it just goes back to the motherhood community respecting each other's decisions, supporting each other. And there's not even like a reason to ask, like, how come you're doing this or whatever. I mean, obviously, if it's somebody that you're close to and you just want to have a heart-to-heart conversation and understand each other and know how to further support each other. But there's no need for any shame in how you're feeding your child. There's no need for any comparison. Nobody's better than anybody else. And we just need more support and respect for each other, for each other's choices, and for just being a mom, whatever that looks like for you, because it's freaking hard. And the last thing you need is shame and judgment. So love on somebody else this week who's parenting different than you are. And next time you see somebody feeding their child differently, just check your heart and your mind, and send them some love. Notice what your initial thought is, and then just be like, you know what? She's doing great, and I'm sending love her way. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, I want to continue to grow as a community. So make sure that you join our Facebook group, Miraculous Mamas by Elizabeth Joy. Check out our Instagram, and just stay tuned for more amazing episodes. Like I said, next week we have Samantha Bush coming on to talk about infertility, and April is Infertility Awareness Month. So her episode's coming out just a few days before April, and she has some awesome things in the works coming out and a book launching, and she's awesome. Again, I just have such an amazing conversation with her. Sometimes you don't know how the conversations are going to go. And I knew she struggled with infertility, and I'm like, okay, yeah, we're going to talk about that. But it just went so much deeper, and there was just so much more in that conversation than what I expected there to be. So definitely make sure that you tune in. April is also C-section Awareness Month. So ICANN has designated a month for C-section awareness. I have an episode coming out in April with a representative for Tatiana. She's a director with ICANN, and we talk a lot about VBACs, how to support VBACs, the statistics and research behind it, how come the C-section rate is so high, and ways that you can potentially prevent that from happening. Also, we obviously recognize that cesareans are life-saving. They are necessary, and there's not some magic pill of being like, oh, if you decide you don't want one, you're not going to get one. That's just not true at all. We are not medical professionals, and we recognize that people in their field know the signs to look for and when that is necessary. So anyways, make sure you check out Miraculous Mamas on all the different platforms. Leave us a review. Tell me what your favorite episode is. If you're catching up on episodes, make sure you go back to last year. Right when quarantine happened, I had amazing episodes coming out, and the world was a beep storm. So a lot of people weren't able to listen because they were trying to adjust to new life and figuring out what they're doing with their kids, what they're doing with their job. So I know a lot of those episodes last year didn't get listened to, but they're really good. So make sure you go back and check those out. All right, guys, we'll talk to you next week. I hope that you have an amazing week. Send some love to a mama who needs it. And I'm super excited to continue to learn and grow with you guys this year. Send me any topics, anything that you want on the podcast, and we will try our best to make that happen. All right, bye.
If you want to be the most interesting person at the cocktail party, well, hop on over and listen to the Brain Candy podcast.
Our award-winning content will have you laughing while you're learning.
We read all the best articles, books, and studies and keep up with new TV shows, documentaries, and pop culture. And then we cram it all into 2 shows a week.
Conspiracy theories, cannibal rabbits, unsolved mysteries, the history of the Walkman. There's something for everyone.
The Brain Candy podcast. Find our link in the show notes.
Or simply search for the Brain Candy podcast on your podcast app.